Moves toward a revived Roman Empire? Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Well, that's what it looks like. We've seen a number of developments in Europe this year that indicate the revived Roman Empire foretold in the books of Daniel and Revelation is drawing ever closer. So let's start with this right here. This is from Remix. It says UK Prime Minister Starmer accused of surrender as Britain pens new agreement with Brussels. So back in 2016, we had the United Kingdom referendum on Brexit, the exit of Britain from, or the United Kingdom from the European Union. And now we're seeing more and more the European Union exercising authority over the United Kingdom. So this says the United Kingdom and the European Union have reached a wide-ranging agreement aimed at expanding cooperation across key areas such as defense, energy, migration, law enforcement, and youth mobility. A deal that critics argue is a flagrant rollback on Brexit. Announced following the UK-EU summit on Monday, the so-called Common Understanding outlines both sides' intention to build on existing post-Brexit frameworks, including the Withdrawal Agreement and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. While the agreement does not constitute a new treaty, it signals a shift toward closer integration in several sectors that effectively bring the UK back into alignment with European Union rules and institutions undermining national sovereignty. The agreement reconfirms reciprocal access to fishing waters until June 2038 and extends bilateral cooperation on energy. It also launches a new security and defense partnership covering topics such as support for Ukraine, cyber defense, military mobility, peacekeeping, and space security. Dialogue is also planned in areas like maritime safety and international disaster response. Now, access to fishing waters has been a bone of contention since the 2016 Brexit vote and is seen as a major concession by the UK. Ahead of the breaking news, rumors had been swirling in Westminster that fishing rights were on the table, leading Reform UK leader Nigel Farage to warn, if true, that will be the end of the fishing industry. Leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, also remarked, 12 years access to British waters is 3 times longer than the government wanted. We're becoming a rule taker from Brussels once again. And with no details on any cap or time limits on youth mobility, fears of free movement returning will only increase. This is very concerning. And so what he's talking about here is you have free movement throughout the European Union. If you enter one nation, you can go into any of the other 26. There are no border controls for passing from one to the other. And now they're talking about something similar happening to the UK once again. So, as to me, this again points to the European Union as an early phase of the global empire we read about in both the books of Daniel and Revelation that will devour the entire world and be ruled over by the Antichrist. So, why do I think that? Well, let's take a look at this right here. This is from Daniel chapter 2, verses 41 through 43. And this is following Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And God gives Daniel the interpretation of this dream. And he's relaying it back to Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, the feet and toes you saw were a combination of iron and baked clay, showing that this kingdom will be divided. Like iron mixed with clay, it will have some of the strength of iron. But while some parts of it will be as strong as iron, others will be as weak as clay. This mixture of iron and clay also shows that these kingdoms will try to strengthen themselves by forming alliances with each other through intermarriage. But they will not hold together, just as iron and clay do not mix. So we see that this kingdom will be divided. It will struggle to hold together. Clearly it does because it conquers the entire world, But what it's showing us is the volatile nature of this relationship, of this alliance between weaker and stronger nations. This is exactly what we see with the European Union. The only thing we don't see in the European Union that indicates that it's this final world empire is we do not see the 10 kings, because we had 10 toes that indicate those 10 kings. We also read in Daniel chapter 7, 10 horns is what's described. And then we see in Revelation 13, 10 crowns. So there's 10 kings or 10 nations that comprise the innermost core of this empire that will conquer the entire globe. So we want to see that come out of the European Union, and then that would be alarm bells should be going off once we see that. But we see all of these other things taking place. It fits every other characteristic of what we read in Daniel and Revelation. And we're seeing things like this. So this is from Foundation for Economic Education. It says, European leaders talk of an EU army. It says Europe is once again talking about forming its own defense alliance. The idea of a European army, discussed on and off since the early days of the Cold War, was revived in February by Zelensky. The Ukrainian president claims that Trump's retraction of military support for Ukraine and ambivalence toward the EU shows that the bloc urgently needs its own military unit. Zelensky has reignited a debate that has failed to generate consensus within Europe, despite its long history. Again, this failure to see consensus. Spain's socialist prime minister, Pedro Sanchez, is the latest EU leader to echo Zelensky, and according to a YouGov poll conducted in 2022, 64% of Spaniards are on his side. On March 28th, he announced that Europe needs its own defense force to combat old imperialist impulses in Russia, especially in light of reduced support from the United States. He called for a military force with troops from all 27 member countries, working under a single flag with the same objectives. Sanchez also wants greater economic integration within the bloc, and recently proposed a debt mutualization scheme, which has caused division along similar lines as the idea of a 27-nation army. And we'll talk about this in a moment, because there's indications we'll see this soon as well, which would be a major development. It goes on, it says, the notion of an EU army was first suggested in the early 1950s as a way of building capability against the Soviet Union without rearming West Germany. Proposed by the French government, it would have consisted of the EU's 6 founding members: France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Italy, West Germany, and Belgium. The treaty creating the European Defense Community was signed in 1952, but never ratified. Instead, West Germany joined NATO and the Western Union, a military alliance formed in 1948, and the idea was shelved. This decades-old idea was revived in 2016. Then, as now, a perceived threat from Russia was intensified by the sudden withdrawal of a military heavyweight. Following the Brexit referendum, in which 52% of the UK opted to leave the EU, the prime ministers of Hungary and the Czech Republic called for a European army. They were joined by Ursula von der Leyen, then Germany's defense minister, and now much higher up within the European Union, who said that Europe needed a Schengen of defense, a reference to the continent's border-free Schengen area made up of 29 nations, 4 of which are outside of the EU. Jean-Claude Juncker, her predecessor as president of the EU Commission, had said a year earlier that the EU needed its own army in order to convey a clear message to Russia that we are serious about defending our European values. Whenever those are perceived to be in danger, the old idea of an EU army is reanimated. Since Brexit, it has steadily gained traction. The idea was endorsed in 2018 by Angela Merkel, then the German Chancellor, and French President Emmanuel Macron. A furious Trump, at that point halfway through his first term, saw it as an act of ingratitude toward NATO. Quote, "They were starting to learn German in Paris before the US came along," he tweeted, a misleading reference to World War II. Not really sure in what way. But Ursula von der Leyen, president of the EU Commission since 2019, has called for a European Defense Union and last month unveiled, quote, "Rearm Europe," a 5-year plan quickly rebranded Readiness 2030 after Spain and Italy complained that the original title was too militaristic. Sanchez didn't explain how that objection sits with his demand for an EU fighting force, presumably armed with more than goodwill. Well, because they like to use these platitudes and flowery language to cover up what they're really trying to do, right? They don't like to say outright what they want to do. They want to lie about it. This is just their nature and what they do, whether it's central bank digital currencies or an EU army. Von der Leyen plans to mobilize 800 billion euros for the bloc's defense over the next 5 years, by which point some analysts believe Russia could be ready to attack a member of NATO or the EU. Italy's foreign minister, Antonio Tajani, also supports the idea of an EU army. One of the major practical difficulties is how a 27-nation army would be funded. The issue of mutual financing has also arisen over the EU's call for members to increase their national defense budgets, and there's no agreement there either. Rather than the cheap loans suggested by von der Leyen as part of the Readiness 2030 plan, heavily indebted southern nations such as Spain and Italy favor common defense bonds, or grants similar to those distributed during the pandemic. And guys, this is a big key right here, common defense bonds, this common joint debt to create a physical union as well as a monetary union, which would further entrench the European Union and pretty much once and for all in the sovereignty of all EU states. So we'll talk more about that in just a moment because there's reasons to believe we'll see that as well. The suggestion has revived a long-standing grievance amongst wealthier northern members such as Germany and the Netherlands, which are reluctant to fund joint initiatives. No Eurobonds, said Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof after a meeting of EU leaders in late March. Another possibility, as recently suggested by France's economy minister, is increasing taxes, especially on the wealthy. Sanchez claims the EU should reconsider the idea of a joint army because its individual members have been unable to find common ground on defense. But that same problem would likely prevent the creation of an EU force. Since their formation almost 20 years ago, none of the EU's battle groups, which typically consist of troops from 3 or 4 countries, have been activated. This hardly suggests that the bloc is ready to form a 27-nation army controlled from Brussels and entering battle under a blue and gold flag. And again, this is exactly what we would expect to see based on Daniel chapter 2. What else do we have? We had this from CNN. From back in March, Germany is unlocking billions to supercharge its military at a seismic moment from Europe. So Germany has the largest economy in the European Union. Here we read, "Do you think you can trust Putin?" German Brigadier General Rolf Halmerstein asked with a wry smile. It's a rhetorical question to which most of Europe would give the same answer. No. As the Trump administration continues to pursue a deal to end the war in Ukraine, one that may end up being more favorable to Moscow than Kiev, Europeans for the first time in decades are focusing on their own military might. Nowhere is that shift as prominent as in Germany. Its armed forces, known as the Bundeswehr, have been the victim of years of underinvestment, but that's set to change. Presumptive Chancellor Friedrich Merz has decided that now is the time for Germany to invest in its military on levels not seen since the Cold War. Germany has just passed a major reform to its constitutional debt brake, unlocking billions of euros in funding, One model shared with CNN suggested that over a 10-year period, with Germany spending 3.5% of GDP, it could amount to 600 billion euros. CNN spent the day with the Bundeswehr and is at an undisclosed location in central Germany as 5 NATO allies took part in training exercises. The simulation was an attack by a foreign adversary on another member of the alliance. Speaking at the makeshift headquarters for the simulation, Hammerstein told CNN, Germany is a capable nation in Europe and has to be a partner for other nations. We're a responsible partner in Europe and a big nation. We've got to step up, and we will do that. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was a seismic moment for the continent. War had returned and the détente that had existed since the fall of the Iron Curtain was over. In Berlin, it kick-started the period known in German as the Zeitenwende, or turning point. In fact, it was the beginning of the effort to step up military spending once again. So again, we see this push across the European Union to increase defense spending, take control over their own defense. We see NATO under assault, the post-World War II alliance of nations led by the United States to defend against what was Soviet aggression. Now they're saying Russian aggression. But guys, we've talked before about the end of the post-World War II global financial and military order, and there's a complete restructuring of that. And it includes more than just the United States and the United States dollar and the United States military. It includes the European Union reorganizing itself and funding its own military needs. And again, we talked about how do they do that, and there are many proposals out there, but let's look at this article as well from March. It says, European chaos is back. EU leaders fail to agree on aid to Ukraine as German debt bonanza blows up pigs' yields. So what are pigs' yields? We're not talking about animals here, but let's skip down to this part and read what it has to say. So this says Germany's new era of big spending, one we just read about, is pulling up borrowing costs across Europe and reigniting jitters around fiscal stability on the continent's periphery. Yields on benchmark Italian, Greek, Spanish, and Portuguese bonds, so that would be where the pigs comes from. I don't know why they didn't put Portugal first, but Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, PIGS, yields on those bonds are over 30 basis points higher compared to the start of the month. The 4 countries also known as PIGS, which were bundled together during Europe's sovereign debt crisis more than a decade ago, so that was way back in 2011, we talked about that at the time, still have the highest debt loads on the continent, making them vulnerable to higher interest rates. That's understandable. After all, Germany had for long been the voice of fiscal discipline in the European Union, pushing for countries like Italy and Spain to tighten their purse strings and opposing the issuance of joint debt. That was the key that stopped further integration of the EU at that time. But now that the formerly austere Germany is preparing to spend like a drunken Sturmtruppen, that's their opinion inserted into this piece, it no longer has any moral ground over the pigs, and indeed, Berlin's new, far more relaxed approach to spending will certainly have negative implications of its own for Europe's most indebted countries, and the market is starting to sniff it out. Quote, if Germany embraces deficit spending, other nations may follow suit, leading to a more relaxed approach to debt across Europe, said Robert Burrows, a portfolio manager at M&G Investments, who says he has reduced his holdings of periphery debt. This could weaken confidence in European government bonds, raising borrowing costs for highly indebted nations. In short, European Sovereign Debt Crisis Part 2 and the obligatory quantitative easing from the European Central Bank is just around the corner. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if the market determines that the debt load of these nations is too much to bear, they're going to start selling those bonds into the free market. And that means one of two things really could happen at that point. We see these bonds just get sold into oblivion and they fall apart, and we see a breakup of the European Union, which I don't think that, again, the European Central Bank and the European Commission, all of the nanny-crats in Brussels would allow to happen after all the work that's been put into that. Or we could see the issuance of joint bonds. We could see the European Central Bank create euros, issue euros to buy back those bonds to soften the impact of free market selling of those bonds and lower the interest rates. But in doing that and undertaking those efforts, that would give effective control, further control over those nations' finances on the part of the European Union, the European Central Bank. And they're talking about war bond issuance and joint bond issuance, which again, Germany typically in the past has opposed. They've been the chief opponent of that. If they are all of a sudden on board with that joint debt issuance, then we would see a fiscal union to go along with the monetary union we'd see, and we'd see the European Union take off on more of an approach of what, say, the United States has in terms of a union. We would see national sovereignty within the European Union eroded even further, and we would take one step further toward EU integration and a much more powerful nation state on the world scene. What else do we have? Well, we mentioned before, there are no 10 kings. That's one of the things that we do not see in the European Union. But I found this interesting. This came out. It's titled, 5 European Defense Ministers Meet in Rome on Friday. So here we're talking about the revived Roman Empire, and we're seeing indications of this. It says defense ministers from 5 major European military powers will meet in Italy on Friday to discuss support for Ukraine, the host country said. The Italian defense minister will host his counterparts from Britain, France, Germany, and Poland, his ministry said Monday in a statement. Now again, this is 5, it's not 10, but it's not too difficult to see this becoming 10. In fact, we have precedent for this. We've mentioned before the Western European Union, which supposedly has been absorbed by the European Union and become antiquated and obsolete, once had 10 nations and described itself as the 10. And we see 4 of those nations represented here: Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. So we see Greece not represented, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. But we see Poland in there in exchange, and we also don't see Belgium in there. But if we saw these other nations or 5 other nations join, then we would have 10 setting up a defense compact within the European Union. And again, we've talked about how we're on the verge of molecular manufacturing, and the creation of that would give whatever nation or group of nations has it the ability to conquer the globe literally overnight. And we could see how this could come out of the European Union very quickly. So we'll have to wait and see how this develops. Will this union come about? Why wouldn't it include all of the European Union? Well, we're seeing differences in how defense should be approached among the western and eastern portions of the European Union. So we could see a division there, or we could see those with the largest militaries taking on those roles. We'll just have to wait and see how that may play out. But again, this is exactly what we would expect to see based on what we read in Daniel and Revelation. So what else do we have? Well, if you missed it, over on the Substack on Tuesday, so yesterday, brittgillette.substack.com, we had this right here. It was titled One Single Move and They'll Trigger a Global Panic. And this is about the rollout of the digital euro. So this is another reason we would see really a solidification of EU control over the continent and over a number of other people around the world based on the rollout of the digital euro. And one of the things that's been pointed out is that this digital euro will put an enormous strain on the banking system in Europe. In fact, it threatens to completely destroy it and cause a global crisis, as those banks are interconnected with the entire global banking system. So again, make sure to head over and check out this article on brittgillette.substack.com to understand what's at play here, what could happen very well. It looks like it's set to happen as part of a plan, because they know this. They're actually taking measures, putting holding limits on how many digital euros a person can hold in order to prevent the bank collapse. Yet they're not rethinking their plans for the digital euro. They're just trying to roll it out slowly until once they have it introduced and adopted, then they'll eliminate those holding limits, destroy the banking system, and the banking system will be the European Central Bank under the control of those authorities, with a central bank digital currency able to control all political opposition. So this is something we need to be paying close attention to, so make sure to head over to brittgillette.substack.com and check that out. I'll pin a link to that at the top of the comments if you want to do so. So what do you think about all this? I think that this points to more and more we're seeing evidence the European Union is the final global empire outlined in the books of Daniel and Revelation, or at least a forerunner of that. It's setting the stage for it, and out of it will come that empire. It includes Rome, which we would expect to see, and we see all of the characteristics except the 10 kings that are mentioned in the Bible. Just those 10 kings. Where do those 10 kings come from? So that remains to be seen, but every other characteristic perfectly describes what we see from the European Union today. So let me know what you think. Leave your comments below. God willing, I'll see you on Friday.